Okay, thank you everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, The Future of Education. My name is Bridget Long, and I am the Dean and Sayers Professor of Education and Economics at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. This series was created in recognition of HGSE's centennial year. In 1920, we welcomed our first class of 64 students. Now, 100 years later, we are a vibrant community of thousands brought together by the shared mission of improving the world through education. The Future of Education series, which has taken place all year, has focused on a range of topics that are important today and destined to become more important in the years to come. Certainly, 2020 ended up being quite a fortuitous year. The impact of the pandemic has highlighted, exacerbated, and increased the urgency for addressing issues such as access and equity and leadership in complex times. I'm looking forward to today's conversation, in which we'll talk about predictions for the future of education and factors that could help determine if we move forward in a positive way. But first, I want to let you know that today's episode is being recorded and will be available to view on the Harvard Education YouTube channel and Facebook page. You can also visit hgse.me/future for past recordings and information about future webinars. We also welcome your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you will also find closed caption access there as well. Now, I'm very delighted to welcome our HGSE faculty speakers. First, we have Karen Brennan, Associate Professor of Education. Her research focuses on the ways in which learning environments, in and out of school, online, and face-to-face, can be designed to support young people's development as computational creators. Then we have Jennifer Cheatham, Senior Lecturer on Education and Director of the Public Education Leadership Project, or PELP. Jen's focus is on leading for equity and transformational change in urban school districts. Next, we have Anthony Jack, Assistant Professor of Education. Tony also holds the Schutzer Assistant Professorship at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. His research documents the overlooked diversity among lower income undergraduates, the doubly disadvantaged, and the privileged poor. Then we have Adriana Umanya-Taylor, who is the Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot Professor of Education. Her work applies developmental science to reduce ethnic and racial disparities and psychological and academic adjustment, which in turn promotes social justice. And then finally, we have Martin West, the Bloomberg Professor of Education and Deputy Director of the Program on Education Policy and Governance at the Harvard Kennedy School. Marty studies the politics of K-12 education in the United States and how education policies affect student learning and non-cognitive development. Thank you to all of the panelists for being here today. Now, before we start with the panel, I just want to acknowledge that HGSE's first 100 years have certainly been eventful. The story of HGSE is a story of pivotal decisions, meeting challenges, and tremendous growth and reinvention. HGSE advocated successfully for education to be recognized as a profession, and we pushed for there to be serious research conducted inside schools. We invested in talent and prepared people to do really some of the toughest jobs in the world, and we've held strongly to the belief that learning and educational success are possible regardless of background, ability, or context. But that is the past, and our centennial events have deliberately tried to focus much more on what is ahead for education and learners everywhere. At HGSE, we are committed to evolving as a school to meet the challenges facing education. And in fact, we have a long history of empowering our students and partners to be innovators in a constantly changing world. And that is needed now more than ever. I want to acknowledge that our conversation today will no doubt be influenced by the disruption and tumult we are all feeling due to COVID. Many of us are grappling with the feeling of simultaneously living in multiple times. There's what we used to do pre-COVID. There's what we're living through now. There's what we imagine and hope for after the pandemic subsides. And then there's what we hope for in the longer term future. But one day this too shall pass. And though the pandemic may have in some ways set us on a new path, I'd like for us to consider not only the near future, but also decades ahead. So my first question for each faculty member is, what do you think education will look like in 25 years? So we're going to start with two of our panelists who approach their work more from the perspective of the individual. So Adriana, could you get us started?
Sure. absolutely. And thanks for the invitation to join the panel, and thanks to all of you who are with us today and listening in. So what will this look like in 25 years? As I reflected on this question, I really was thinking about the current ethnic racial breakdown of our schools and our K-12 population. And currently, students of color in the US make up 52% of our K-12 student body. And when we look at Black and Latinx students specifically, we see that they make up 42% of our K-12 students. So as I think forward to 25 years from now and think about what the projected growth is for students of color in our education system, we're certainly going to have a demographic composition in which students of color are easily going to make up over 60% of our student body. So I'll say that for me, when I think about this question, what I think our education system will look like in 25 years is really going to directly depend on how well we are addressing issues of ethnic racial inequity in our education system now and in the next 5 years, which will set us on a trajectory for that 25-year mark. And I guess, if we don't do what I think and what others think, obviously, is needed to really change the structural and individual forces of ethnic racial inequity that we're seeing in our system now, we're going to continue down a path of failing to serve our students of color, failing to prepare them to reach their amazing potential. And so I think given these demographic projections, that means that we could potentially have a system of education in which a clear majority of our students may be failing. But I'm optimistic, and I believe that the events of the past 8 months are leading us down a path that centers and prioritizes issues of ethnic racial equity in our schools. And if I follow that line of thinking, I think that in 25 years, I see an education system that's going to be prioritizing students' ethnic racial identity development as a competency that's nurtured, supported, and integrated into school curricula. I also see an educator workforce that is representative in terms of ethnic racial background of the students who are being served. I envision a system in which we're investing in our educators by providing them with training and the time that they need to grow in their own understanding of their ethnic racial inequities and their ethnic racial identities, and how to create culturally sustaining environments in which all students will thrive. And when I think about those changes, I think we'll be pleased with where education will be in 25 years. And I think that we'll be solving other problems rather than being perplexed by why we cannot close an achievement gap between white students and Black or Latinx students. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say about this, and also unpacking some of these comments. But I think I'll stop right there for now.
Thank you so much, Adriana. Tony, would you go next, please?
Yeah, it's always hard to follow Adriana, but I'll do my best. When I was thinking about the question of where we will be in 25 years, I returned to something I heard LeVar Burton say in one of his episodes. He said that what we can imagine, we can make manifest. And I want to extend that to say that which we work for in our scholarship and in our engagement, we can ensure. So I'm glad to follow Adriana in the sense that when we talk about these kind of structural inequalities, they naturally are paramount to understanding how students move through K through 12. But I hope that we also pay just as much attention to those inequalities as students enter college, because it's incredibly important that we be able to support students on this journey, especially as a BA is becoming more and more important to secure a stable working class and middle class living. And I want to be optimistic as well. I mean, I wouldn't be doing the research that I'm doing if I didn't believe that we can actually affect change. So I want to say I see universities working, and some I would say being successful, closing the gap between access and inclusion. I see them making concerted efforts to focus as much on who they admit as they do on the experience of those who accept the invitations to be members of their community. This requires expanding our thinking about what matters in college, especially moving beyond quantifiable outcomes to understand more about the how students are moving through higher education. I want us to question, I hope we continue to do so, what we take for granted about what students know and what they can afford, and turn this into a new way of thinking about more inclusive policies that help students not just graduate, but do so whole and healthy, ready for the next adventure. I sincerely hope that this framework is built upon a deeper and more nuanced understanding of how inequality and poverty shape not only students' college destinations, but also their daily lives as they assume the role and the title of undergraduate. When we think about the difference in funding in school districts, the $23 billion difference between predominantly white school districts, the way in which we are still grappling with the legacy of redlining, blockbusting, and the unequal access to FHA loans and the like, we must be able to think about how these structural inequalities manifest themselves on our college campuses, not just where students go, but the everyday reality as they march towards graduation. And I hope as we inform policy to talk about the racial inequalities in the country, to bring us closer to practices to address them, we will be able to do the same on a college campus as well.
Thank you so much, Tony. So I'd like to ask the same question to two colleagues who think more about groups and classrooms and systems. Again, what do you think education will look like in 25 years? Karen, will you go next, please?
Yes, thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here, and I'm so excited about the ideas that have already been surfaced. So I tend to think about everything through the lens of design, and design fundamentally is about seeing the world not just as it is presently or as it has been, but as it might be. So I would offer to our conversation today that cultivating this stance is exactly what the work of education should be, whether that's now in our present moment, or 5 years from now, or 25 years from now, or maybe even 100 years from now. Our work should be to support people in seeing the world as it might be, and then helping them make those visions for what might be our new realities. Now, this is a view of the future of education that is both very present oriented. The future isn't an abstraction. The future is happening right now. What we do every day, what we do today really matters. It's also very action oriented. One of my very favorite aphorisms about the future is from the computer scientist Alan Kay, who said that the best way to predict the future is to invent it, to create it. And this is by no means a new view of education. Since we are gathered in celebration of HGSC centennial, we can actually look back 100 years to the writing of John Dewey, who is making this very argument in Democracy and Education about the purpose of schools. He wrote that the business of education is to liberate the young from reviving and retraversing the past, rather than to lead them to a recapitulation of it. So the questions that I love to ask in my research and in my teaching are focused on this design orientation. What can we be doing? What is the role of education in supporting people in imagining, envisioning, dreaming new possibilities for themselves, for others, for the world, and then transforming those imagined possibilities into lived realities? Obviously, there's a lot to say about the incredibly important role that schools can play in this work, but I'll pause here with this as my initial offering to the group.
Yes, we're all excited to get you on in conversation together, but thank you for those words, Karen. Jen.
Thanks, Bridget, and I'm loving hearing my colleagues' comments. I'm getting revved up already. And I'm going to try to bring my practitioner and leader lens to this conversation. I mean, I think the disruption of this past year has opened up the possibility for real and radical change in the next 25 years, and aimed at some of the things my colleagues have talked about, not only students' academic success, but their social, emotional, and healthy identity, well-being, and development, a more expansive understanding of what success looks like. And I think we'll be seeing a few things, and I think there's movement here already. I think we'll be seeing more relevant, representative, and historically accurate curriculum, something our students have been demanding, I think, for years. I think we are going to see more humanizing instructional designs that are responsive to the interests, talents, needs of the real people in schools, right? Both our students and the teachers who work with them. Supports that integrate all that students, staff, and family need to thrive. That's something I think our teachers have been asking for a long time. And I think we're going to see stronger partnerships across multiple institutions committed to long-term planning, right? Long-term planning that is required to address the biggest challenges. That's planning that's beyond our single tenures, beyond our term limits, and something that our communities have been asking for a very long time. But what I think it's going to take to actually follow through on those things and more is a real commitment to the movement for racial and social justice and a new leadership paradigm that's very different from the leadership paradigm of the last 25 years. I don't think that those things happen unless we have leaders that face racism and oppression head on. In 25 years, I would hope that it is no longer radical for a school district leader, like a superintendent, to talk about white supremacy culture and point to the ways that we have disrupted it from our boardrooms to the classrooms. I don't think that any of these things will happen if we don't embrace a more humanizing approach to leadership, right? Leaders who value listening and healing, who allow for not only transparency, but vulnerability, and who are seeking compassionate understanding of both our organizations and the communities that they serve. And in 25 years, I would hope that we would see a lot more women and people of color leading education organizations at every level, and not only leading them, but getting to bring their full selves to those jobs. And then lastly, I think these things won't happen unless we have leaders who are committed to actual sharing power, right? Centering the voices of students and families who are most marginalized, but not only centering and lifting their voices, but actually sharing power in ways that we haven't, and following through on their asks. And I know that this is the leadership paradigm that is already emerging in the field, and one that could unlock potential in ways that we just haven't seen yet. I'll pass it back to you, Bridget.
All right, thank you so much, Jen. And last but certainly not least, Marty, could you give us more of the kind of macro and policy perspective?
Absolutely. Thanks, Bridget. And thanks to everyone who's joining us today. And I have to say, I'm inspired by everything I just heard my colleagues share. But as inspired as I am, my own starting point in thinking about this question is that we shouldn't underestimate the possibility that the future of education will look a lot like the present, or perhaps, given the disruption that we're experiencing right now, like education as it existed on the eve of the pandemic. Not the certainty, but the possibility that that will be the case. And I say that for three reasons. First, I think education institutions are inherently conservative in the sense that they're resistant to change. We all experience a given set of institutions and practices that shape our understanding of schools and schooling and how they should be organized. And those who emerge with the greatest power in society, as well as those who enter the field of education, tend to be people who had the most positive experiences with those institutions and practices. And that makes what David Tyack and Larry Cuban have called the grammar of schooling very sticky. Second, there are often political barriers to the kinds of policy changes that may be needed to produce a more fundamental transformation. There are all sorts of stakeholders with a vested interest in existing arrangements, and the American political system gives them plenty of opportunity to block change. And third, while I certainly see the potential for change due to the pandemic, I certainly think we will see changes here at HGSE. What I see above all in the present moment is a desire for normalcy, as well as an increased appreciation of the custodial function that schools play in our society. So as I think about the potential sources of change in education, and in American education in particular, I tend to think more about longer term trends as the key drivers. So Adriana already mentioned demographic change, and I think that's critically important. Rather than noting the increasing diversity that she did, I will point to another major shift, and that's that the birth rate in the US has fallen sharply. It fell sharply during the Great Recession and hasn't really recovered. That, combined with a sharp drop in both authorized and unauthorized immigration, means that the number of students in the US is predicted to decline a good bit in coming decades. And that will create some challenges and opportunities that we could discuss later. But one thing it means is that there likely are going to be continued school closures, like we're already seeing in some segments of higher education. A second mega trend I would point to is the ongoing automation of white collar jobs with the rise of artificial intelligence. I hope that's going to mean growing emphasis in schools on the social and emotional skills that are distinctively human, and as research by our colleague Dave Deming shows, are increasingly rewarded in the labor market. Counterintuitively, it could also mean a greater supply of teachers as other options for college educated adults dry up. And one of the things we've seen in the pandemic is that there's no real automated substitute for a personal relationship with a teacher. So fewer students in schools, renewed emphasis on the whole child are two things that I see and coming and think we need to be preparing for. But I think we need to take seriously the reality that change is not natural in education and it won't happen without significant effort.
All right. Thank you, Marty. So it's wonderful. We've got these very disparate views. You guys have not disappointed. I want to note, and as many of our participants have already realized, you can submit questions using the Q&A tool. We'll get to those later and perhaps even start to weave things in. I can tell my colleagues you are getting just across a range of reactions to the tidbits that you started us with. But let's get deeper into it. And what I'd really like to do is start to unpack. So I gave you the hard question of 25 years ahead, but obviously COVID is heavy on our minds right now. So what do you think the impact of COVID is going to be, this pandemic and the implications of it, and say the next 5 years? What do you think the takeaways are going to be? And I open that up for whoever would like to get started. Please don't make me cold call.
You may have to do that, Bridget. We're too polite.
So, Jen.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Before the pandemic hit, the years before, as a leader, I was coming to the realization that the kind of balance of our work as practitioners was off, and largely driven by the larger policy environment and potentially lack of resources as well. But we were very much focused on kind of year-to-year instructional improvement planning, right? What are our goals for next year? What are our strategies for meeting those goals? How will we monitor our progress for those goals? You get the idea. Like, this is kind of the work of school leaders has been about, and district leaders supporting them in doing so. And because we were spending so much time on those cycles of planning, we were spending little and sort of disconnected time planning the actual instructional design of school. Who teaches which children, when, on what, and how, right? Including the full integration of technology, right, into schooling, right? We spent this much time on instructional planning and this much time on instructional design. And we kept suffering for it. Like, every year when I would go out and talk to teachers about what the problems they were facing, they sounded to me like instructional design problems that needed instructional design solutions. I hope that makes sense. And then the pandemic hits and I'm like, oh my God, if we had been spending time actually knowing our children and our staff and designing school for them, right, at the center, then we might be not feeling the pain quite in the way that we are, because suddenly we're having to use new skills and muscles, instructional design skills and muscles. So I say that all because I think we're learning something, right, about maybe what the real work of school is all about. And I don't know for sure what it means for the immediate next years, but I'm trying to figure out, like, how do we build this new capacity now that we know that it's been lacking, and how do we do it quickly? I don't know if that sparks anything for anyone, but that's where my head is.
Well, Karen, you were definitely talking about learning design, and then I'd love to bring in Adriana.
Yeah, so much of what you said, Jen, resonates with me, and comments that people have made about the role of teachers in this moment like strike a deep chord with me. So I think in this moment, I'm both like deeply optimistic and slightly less optimistic is maybe how I will frame it. I mean, where I am deriving great optimism is there has been so much pedagogical imagination deployed in this moment. And it has been so inspiring to see what new opportunities have been made possible for learning, for relationships, as numerous people have mentioned already. Where I'm slightly less optimistic is there is this somewhat worrying rhetoric around the lost generation, that there's this like whole impact of COVID-19 on learners. And certainly there is profound inequities, and I would not deny that whatsoever. But just sort of throwing our hands up and saying there's this lost generation, I think reflects a worrisome type of rigidity in our thinking about what's possible. Like, we built these systems and structures. Could we possibly imagine new ways of being and reprioritizing? So I hope we hold on to that.
Adriana.
Yeah, so I think that along with both of these comments and really, Jen's initial comments, it just really resonates with me, because as I think about what what have been the opportunities that this COVID-19 pandemic has actually provided for us, and I really think about this way of recognizing that, as Jen said, our standard ways of doing things will not work. They will not work. And so now we have to actually go back to getting to know our students in this context. And I think the other thing that happened, and that has happened along with this, and is so key to the optimism that I have for the future about education, is that as horrible and terrible as the pandemic has been for so many people, and for all of us across the globe, there has been a small silver lining, which is that it has really shined this bright spotlight on the ethnic, racial inequities that we have in many different systems in our society and in other societies. But focusing just on education, I think that what this has done now is that we have these multiple pieces coming together, and we're getting to know our students, but we're also getting to know our students with this lens of recognizing that we've got these disparities. And so not only is our standard way of doing things not going to work because of the situation we're facing with remote learning and whatnot, right? But the normal and standard way of doing things that really has perpetuated a system of ethnic racial inequity, we now get to re-envision, and we get to re-envision it with this lens. So I just think that that's a really great opportunity that I haven't seen in the time I've been engaged in this work.
So I'm definitely hearing, and I've seen myself, the conversation has changed. We talk a lot more about meeting the student where they are. What is their family, their neighborhood, thinking it's not one size fits all. But I wonder, to kind of throw back at, will we continue this conversation? Will it go anywhere? Is there the political will to make sustaining change, even though now we're most certainly talking about really important issues that were previously ignored?
So, Bridget, I'll jump in on that briefly. So I do think a recognition of the importance of attending to the whole child, socially, emotionally, in terms of their ethno-racial identity, is something that is coming out of the pandemic. As a member of the State Board of Education here in Massachusetts, involved in efforts to try to get as many students in school as quickly as possible, obviously attending to the safety challenges with that. But what's really driving that conversation or that effort, as much as concerns about academic losses, is really what we're seeing in terms of a mental health crisis among young people in the Commonwealth. And we're hearing it from doctors and the like. And so I do think this is contributing to what was already underway in terms of a shift in thinking to broader systems of performance management in education, trying to encourage a more holistic approach. I think the real trick is going to be finding the right balance and how we can both value what schools do in terms of academic preparation and ideally encourage them to, integrate efforts to support students in broader ways into those efforts to ensure that they're also academically prepared for post-secondary work or whatever follows their K-12 experience.
Okay.
Yeah, if I can, I'm really glad that you mentioned mental health, Mario, because I think it actually ties both your questions, Bridget. What I'm seeing right now is that you mentioned it perfectly, the exacerbation of inequalities. And because even before COVID, we saw how certain campuses around the country were closing. Certain colleges, we saw consolidations. But now we're also seeing the rise in the number of people who not only will need financial aid, right? We already know the kind of stratification, higher education, and more people who are going to need financial aid, but more people who are going to need different kind of supports that university will have to invest resources in. And the question is, we are at this fork in the road moment between not just the financial stability of the university, are we going to meet enrollment numbers, are the cohorts going to keep replenishing enough people to go to college? We also must attend to what students will need in the immediate future right now. When I was, as I was traveling around the country, even before COVID and especially after, mental health services right now know how to help students, for example, through divorces and the loss of grandparents. But on college campuses, they were less prepared to help students through loss of a farm, through accidents for people whose parents or family were part of coal mines and the closings, and let alone drive-by shootings or other localized, more localized shocks to the system. Now you have COVID on top of everything, where everyone is experiencing a pandemic, but we know that the hurt has been uneven. Black, Latinx, and also especially Native American communities have been disproportionately hurt by it. So when students come to campus, now we have to prepare not just to teach them carbonyl chemistry and Marx's grand theory of history, but we also must attend to their social emotional toll that we have now. And this means investing significant resources in a time where some universities are already making very dangerous decisions about admitting less qualified rich students through merit aid and different things like that to meet their, to stay in the black. And so I worry the way in which COVID-19 is going to make us think about the longevity of the institution even more than we were before, but some things that can possibly fall by the wayside is how students are experiencing the university that you're trying to perpetuate, that you're trying to keep alive. And so if we don't begin to think about how to support, and I also want to say, it's not just students and staff as well. I do not want to forget the individuals who actually allow this place to run, but the different communities that have been affected by it, I do worry about how it exacerbated this, but also at the same time, it means that we take on additional responsibilities, especially with the social emotional health of racial and ethnic minorities.
Yeah, Tony, you make a really great point. Thank you for bringing in perspectives from higher ed. As someone who studies higher ed, but also spends a lot of time in the K through 12, this has been a unique time where so many of the trends that we're seeing really cross boundaries, regardless of the age of the learner. And it has also been, vitally important, I know for our own community, for me to remind students, they're not the only ones going through the pandemic. The faculty and the staff, we're all dealing with this uncertainty at the same time, so it's affecting us all. Let's broaden that though, because I know we have a number of viewers who are coming to us from outside of the US. See Portugal, Malaysia, shout outs from all over the world. has this also brought us closer to school systems, leaders, issues and topics across boundaries? You know, what have you seen globally?
You know, Bridget, I've heard the pandemic described as our first truly global event, meaning something that everyone around the world is experiencing simultaneously. And that description sort of resonated with me. I think the connections between American school systems and school systems internationally have only strengthened in the recent decades. And I think that process will likely continue and even accelerate in the future. I'm not sure if that's a direct result of the pandemic or rather to the same changes in terms of globalization that have made the pandemic a truly global event, the stronger connections between people internationally. But I think, you've seen the growing salience of international assessments of student achievement, comparisons across countries in terms of their approaches to education, what we can learn from them. Right now, a lot of people in the United States comparing the approach to school reopening in Europe to their own, which seems to have placed a greater priority on getting kids back in school, maybe relative to other aspects of social life. So my sense is that is a trend that's been ongoing, increased efforts to learn internationally in a collaborative manner, and is likely to continue.
Do others want to join in?
I think I would just add that it has been really striking to me the similarities that we've seen in other nations in terms of the disproportionate effects of this pandemic on marginalized communities. And in different nations, that marginalization comes at the hands of a different social identity, perhaps. But the issue of being a member of a marginalized group is really sort of at the core of this issue. And so I just, I agree with my colleague, Marty, and just think that we see this sort of across different sectors. And it's really striking to me how this has sort of increased our commonality that we share with some of these other nations.
Bridget, I would love to chime in on that too. This is not my area of expertise, but I teach a workshop on leadership entry, equity-focused and human-centered design of leadership entry. And we have students from all around the world taking this course. We just had a webinar yesterday. And I mean, it's incredible to me to see the commonality in what all these leaders around the world are facing during this tremendous time. I mean, the power of that conversation really struck me yesterday and worried me. I think we're going to see some major turnover in leaders in our profession. I think this has put a tremendous strain on them, and it worries me about the future, not just in the US, but worldwide. And it worries me about the state of the teaching profession as well. And I think that's a conversation that's happening globally.
The one thing I want to add to this conversation is I am excited about the amount of exchange and research and scholarship and policy, policies and practices about how do we respond to COVID and how we think about things. But what I worry about is the lack of exchange of interaction between individuals. I think about the way in which the international students and students that not just studying abroad, but the way in which access to education within the United States for international students, especially going forward, given that we have seen the greater bifurcation of international students between the very wealthy and then those who would essentially receive full financial aid. Will universities be able to still support both groups of students, both with visas and everything like that, given the political climate that we have also seen? So I do worry about the exchange I just think about all the value that students get from engaging people from around the world in the same classroom, whether it's a seminar and it's just 5 other people, or you're in a grand lecture hall with 100 other people, like that kind of, and I miss that tremendously. And I want us to, again, make space for that possibility, not just between the researchers who are running labs in 3 different countries, but making sure that we are getting access to the full range of potential students from around the world. And I don't want that to be lost when the world finally opens back up to us to travel.
Yes. So I want to again thank all the participants on this webinar who are submitting questions, have been reading through and just want to start bringing them into the conversation. But let me ask the questions in very concrete ways. 10, 20 years from now, what do you think the role of technology is going to be and what's going to determine that? So now we've done remote, but we've also seen the inequities. Where do you think we're going to be 10 to 20 years from now? Will it still be center, or will we have moved on in different ways?
I want to cold call Karen for that one.
Thank you. Well, it has been so striking to me that I started teaching 22 years ago, and I cannot imagine, had the pandemic struck, that like, would I be sending packets in the mail? Would I be sending these like text-based emails to students? So it's like, it's almost utterly unimaginable to then project 25 years into the future, 20, 25 years into the future, what that might mean. I mean, my stance on technology is that it should always be in the service of our human purposes and interests. So we've talked about racial equity. We've talked about building relationships. So like, what are all the ways that our values, our purposes, our goals can lead, and not the tech? Because too often there's this like technological determinism that takes hold of us and like, oh, we have to follow the tech, but it should always be the opposite. So that's my offering about tech.
And I think that may have been one lesson with all of this, that it has to first start with the learning goals and the learners, and then applying the tech. But what about the role of the teacher? So we've certainly seen the role of the teacher changing during the pandemic, lots more demands, but also I'm hoping, maybe if I'm optimistic, the acknowledgement of just how important teachers are. Fast forward 10 years, what do you think the role of the teacher is going to be?
Well, I'll look back 10 or 15 years, and if you're looking at writing about technology and education at that time, there was a lot of enthusiasm for the idea that technology might help us solve our teacher supply problems or teacher quality problems, that there was a lot of hope that technology would be able to, in some ways, displace the role of the teacher to the benefit of students. And you don't hear much talk about that these days. And I think we've been chastened by our experience with at least the first generation of virtual or digital, fully online instruction. And I think this pandemic has only reinforced that. I think it's opened up new possibilities in terms of remote instruction. And I hope we can be beyond the days of snow days. Don't tell my kids in the next room that I said that, but I don't think there's a need for those types of interruptions to instruction anymore. But I haven't seen anything that doesn't involve or obviates the need for a caring instructor who plays a key part in generating the motivation for student learning, much less attending to their social and emotional needs. And so I think the role of the teacher will evolve, but it's not going to go away in the way some people predicted.
But I hope, and Bridget, even how you frame the question is, I think we are finally seeing just how many hats teachers wear, right? And so one thing that I hope through this is that the number of different staff positions at school expands, because teachers can't be teacher, counselor, social worker, agent, college advisor, all of these different hats, right? That, you already have, and especially if you think about where you are teaching, right? You have overload in predominantly in lower income communities, communities of color, urban centers as compared to their suburban counterparts. And even then, suburbia doesn't, cancel out inequality. But I hope that we begin to actually understand that some of the reasons why teachers can't be as effective teachers is because they're wearing 5 hats at one particular time. And when that thing, and also when I think that translates to other members of staff. I mean, how many times has the custodian actually been the biggest counselor on the high school or the middle school campus? I think we need to really think about who the kind of community, big C, that a school actually is, and what are the ways that we can actually foster that. And so instead of running from it, it's like towards Zoom and Google Meets and Microsoft Hangouts or whatever it is, you actually say, okay, wow, it's not, you're not on Google when you are meeting with the lunch lady who, for my case, gave me an extra cookie every once in a while when I was feeling down or something like that. Like those little moments that really helped you through school and made you feel at home, because that's another thing that we've learned is that school has also been more than just school. It has been the place where they've got their meals, where they felt safe, where they kept warm when it was cold outside, or had heat or had AC when it was too hot. The only place they had access to internet. Like teachers and principals and lunch ladies and security guards have been doing more than one job. And I think this pandemic has really shown light on that. Do we have not just the political will, are we courageous enough to actually recognize it, and then support it?
I love that. I just want to chime in here because I just want to keep that comment going and reverberating through the airwaves here. I just ultimately think that, what is the next 25 years going to bring? I think that this is going to hinge on how much are we willing to invest in educators and all of these additional supports in the school, which essentially make learning possible. These are the individuals who are making the future minds of the nation possible, right? And I just feel like we need to just really get a megaphone and repeat that comment from Tony.
So building from that point, because I caught on that as well. Some of the questions ask about politics, but I want to kind of set that up a little bit differently. We've talked about more optimistic views of the future and some that are not quite. So what's going to determine that? Will it be politics and administration? Will it be families and communities that are now involved in a different way? Who's going to win out on determining what the future will look like? I didn't promise easy questions, guys.
I do want to say one thing, and I got this from Imani Perry in a conversation I had with her at Amherst. There has never been a social movement, political movement, where academics, or rather research and informed policy, has not been part of the initial conversation. Understanding our reality, understanding the way in which previous systems have set us up in the position that we are in. I fundamentally believe that as part of, to answer your question, we as academics and scholars must be part of the conversation and not limit ourselves to just articles behind paywalls or policy at the end of a paragraph, policy paragraphs at the end of that paper. We have to, I'm not trying to say everybody should try to be on CNN and be a pundit and things like that, but the way in which we must engage the larger public in a way that doesn't ostracize them because they don't have PhDs like we do, or EDLDs or EDDs like we do. The way in which we have to not just sit in the ivory tower and let our work be translated or even write in such a way that it's engaging, accessible, so that we can inform everyday conversations and policy. And that's very important to me as a first generation college student. A lot of what happens in college is geared towards spoken about in such a way that it really is for people who have had a certain pedigree, and that pedigree does not look like mine. And then when you think about how that gets translated into policy, whose voice is informed in such a way, I think we have to be part of that. That as we say like here at Huxley, like that usable knowledge is so important, and it's getting it in the hands of everybody, not everyday individual, just everybody is incredibly important to me about how we inform that conversation.
So I'd love to hear from the rest of you, which Tony's definitely taken it. So what is our responsibility as scholars? What's our responsibility as HGSE to help determine what the future is going to look like? What are things we should be doing?
Can I, just like Adriana did, double down on what Tony said? I think I have a hard time adding to what he just said. I think, look, the academy and research and public facing research plays a huge role over the long run in shaping culture, and politics is downstream of culture. And, I think one of the things I started to question and amidst the pandemic was the extent to which Americans really do place a great deal of value on education and public education. It's a key part of, the American dream and aspects of our identity. But when you look at some of the decisions that we've made around this experience, it's not the obvious to me. And so I do think we need to, Tony used the language of social movements. We need to a social movement of a kind to really value education. And people are going to differ in what exactly that means. But I think we can try to build consensus on education's importance, and that's going to really be important moving forward.
I think that's key. I think that's really key. I want to respond to your question, Bridget, about sort of what's our responsibility and what, what's our responsibility here also. And I really think that, we've been really tested in the last 4 years in terms of really our our strength in elevating the importance and the reality of science, right? And I feel like a big responsibility that we have here is to really double down on our efforts to conduct the high quality research that we've been conducting, and making sure that as Tony, noted, that this research is not just living in the journals and at the conferences, but it's actually being translated into practice, and it's being, it's transforming policy, informing policy, transforming communities and schools. I think that that's really critical. I also think, sort of on the practice side of things, that we have a really significant responsibility to prioritize our efforts in a way that focuses on training our pre-service teachers and preparing pre-service teachers, and continuing our really amazing efforts in professional education that continue to prepare our workforce for a changing system, right? And to deal with all of the challenges that are coming to us or that have been here, and we're finally able to sort of shine a spotlight on it and say, okay, we've got to address this. So I feel like there's like a really significant responsibility for us in terms of the research, in terms of translating that research, but then also in terms of the practice components of what we're doing. And really, I also think, and this might just be a little bit, selfish, but finding ways to foster collaborations between the folks who are more heavily engaged in the research components of things, the folks who are more, and their expertise is more in the practice, and then the folks whose expertise is really in the policy and making this happen. Because ultimately, I think that until we all find really productive and efficient ways to work together, we're not going to see as quick of a change as we need to.
I love all of that. I would love to just add on. I've been hallelujah-ing and amening so many of your comments over here. I don't know if that's okay to say, but I just said it. I do want to add that I think HGSC, in addition to all that was just said, with an emphasis on partnering with people in the field, needs to interrogate our own practice, right? I mean, just like I've been thinking as a practitioner, what have I done that I did well? What have I done that contributed to the problem? And what does it mean for me next? I want for all of us, right, as researchers, as policy experts, and as practitioners, I think we have a responsibility to really think about what our contributions have been, both good and not so good, so that we can be really clear on how we want to move forward as an institution. I'm really excited about that.
Karen, do you want to try to answer this question? What is HGSC's responsibility, or what's our responsibility as scholars?
Yeah, it's such a beautiful question. Well, I hope that we embrace the future as something we can create rather than something that just happens to us. And I hope that there's increasing space and support in education for dreaming of ourselves and the world in new ways within and beyond classrooms, acting in the service of climate justice, economic justice, educational justice, racial justice. And I think our responsibility is to live that at HGSC through our courses, through our research. And I'm profoundly optimistic about our ability to do that. I saw a lovely question in the Q&A asking why optimism is warranted. And I don't know if it's warranted, but it's certainly required. I think education requires radical optimism and generous criticism.
And so, Karen, you've helped kind of preview my last question. So I'm looking at the time, we're almost out of time. I want to ask each panelist, we have a number of participants still on the call who must have been attracted because they're interested in this issue. What's one piece of advice or idea that you want to leave them with as they also contribute to determining what the future is, good or bad? Final ideas?
I'll start, so we're not, waiting for the cold call from Marty. So I just loved the way that Karen, you opened up your comments, or at the very beginning of the hour, which was with that quote: "The best way to predict the future is to create it." I just feel like that would be the thing that I would leave everyone with, is this idea that optimism is warranted, and we care so deeply about education, and we care about these issues of equity, but we need to consistently and constantly speak up and bring these to the forefront in every single context that we're in. Because if we do that, then we will be able to predict a future where we're going to see all of these changes that we've talked about so optimistically today.
Any other comments from the panel? I know we're reaching 4 o'clock.
I'll just go back to the point I made at the beginning, which is that change in education is not natural, that it's the exception and rather than the rule, and that it takes work and ideas matter. I think the work we do at HGSC, the example that we set, as Karen points out, really matter, but then we need to find ways to translate those ideas into action and to build support for them. And it takes a lot of work.
Yes. So I think both being optimistic, but also realistic, as Marty said. One thing that's clear with the pandemic, so many things changed that we never thought were possible. I think the question is, can we capture that and move forward? Because that really will determine what the future will be. So I want to thank my panelists for being here, my colleagues, my friends, Karen, Jen, Tony, Marty, Adriana. Appreciate your time. I ask for all of you in the audience to please stay in touch. And remember, you can visit hgse.me/future to rewatch this and to find out about other episodes. So please take care and stay well. Thank you, everyone.